Let's go ahead and get started. Today's session, we're going to talk about compositing. And compositing is kind of a loose term for any time you're going to take parts of different pictures and put them together to create a new composite piece of artwork. And this is really what using layers is all about. And there's a bazillion different kinds of composites you can create. Something as simple as using a texture overlay or doing a multiple exposure is a composite, all the way up to building a layout like you would put in a book that would actually have multiple layers and backgrounds and borders and things like that as a composite as well. I'm going to go through it and we're going to do about 3 or 4 different examples of different types of composites and hopefully give you guys some food for thought on what you can do with a layered workflow. And I'm going to start here in layers today. At the end of each example, we'll kind of pause and ask for questions. But Liz, if a question comes up that makes sense, just interrupt me anytime.
All right.
The first one we're going to do is going to be a fairly basic example of how to work with textures. I'm keeping track of my images here in Lightroom. I'm just going to select the image that I want to work on, and then I'm just going to go up here to the File menu, go to Plugin Extras, and I'm just going to select Perfect Photo Suite. When you select the suite, it's going to automatically open up into layers, and layers is kind of the home base of the suite, and that's where you can control the layers, create copies, do all sorts of great layer-based workflow things, and then send individual layers to the different plugins like Perfect Effects or Perfect Black and White. You can also send it to one of those plugins directly. If you just wanted to turn this image black and white, I could just send it directly to Perfect Black and White and bypass that step in layers. But for doing composites, most of the work we're going to do today will be in Perfect Layers, so I'm just going to send it to either the Perfect Photo Suite or Perfect Layers. They actually take you to the same place. So we'll give Lightroom a second to send it over to us, and there we go. All right, so this shot straight out of the camera, no work done at all to it. I want to go ahead and I'm going to add some textures to it to kind of give it a little bit more of a vintage look. Now you could do that inside of Perfect Effects if you want to, and I'm just going to quickly show you how you get to the textures in Perfect Effects, but we're actually going to do most of our work today in layers instead. So I'm just going to jump to Effects first and show you where you can access those textures. When you load up effects on the left-hand side, you'll see all of the categories of all the different effects that come with it. I'm just going to make this a little bit larger. And down in the T's, you'll notice there's a category of textures for fabric, metal, natural paper, photographic, text, walls, etc. To apply one of those textures, the easiest thing to do is just to click on the Quick View Browser button on the category that sounds interesting. So let's say I'm going to go to the paper category, and I just click right here on the little Quick View Browser button, and this will actually pop up a nice full screen preview of what those textures would look like on top of my image. You can then just scroll down, find the one you want. Let's say, oh, I want to do this tattered gray paper one. I click on it, and it will add that effect to my image. And I can stack multiple effects here inside of Perfect Effects, and you can control how strong each one is by using the amount slider. And in a lot of cases, doing your textures through Perfect Effects is a great place to do it. The only downside to doing it here is when you actually hit the Apply button, all of the work you do in Perfect Effects is kind of squished down into one composite layer. All of your results go to one spot. What I like to do is do it through layers instead, because it gives me a little bit more flexibility. I can always go back and change my mind and change my settings. I'm going to cancel out of here. We'll go back to layers. And one of the great hidden features in the suite is this little extras tab right up here in the built-in file browser. So the browser tab lets you keep track of images that maybe aren't in your Lightroom catalog. This is really handy for me because Lightroom only lets you keep one catalog open at a time, and I do it on a client-by-client basis. But I have another folder that I keep common things that I use, where I keep things like my textures or my logo that I want to add as a watermark. So this lets me get to my common resources without having to switch my Lightroom catalogs. But the Extras tab over here is where all of the extra content that gets installed with the suite lives. And any background, any border, and any texture that's installed as part of the suite also gets installed into this Extras folder, and you can access it to use in any of your own creative designs. So you notice there's a texture category, and if I roll it down, there's those same texture categories we just saw inside of Perfect Effects. All right, so let's get started, and we're going to add some textures to this. The first one I want to do is I want to add kind of a grungy texture to it. So I'm going to go to the metal category. We'll use that Quick View Browser option again. We'll click on it, and it actually shows us all those textures that come in there. And one of my favorites is this one right here, the grunge vignette. It's got a nice warm, or a nice bright spot in the middle, nice dark grungy edge to it. And it's a great way to darken the edge of your image, but do it in kind of a non-uniform grungy way. So just click on it. You'll get a little message that says, hey, you've already got an image open. What do you want to do with this? Do you want to add it as a layer, or do you want to switch to and use it as a new document? Whenever I want to add something, I just click the Add button, and it will insert that image as a new layer. So you notice over here, my layers palette, it appears on its own layer above my image. If I turn the eyeball off, you can see the layer underneath, and I can drag those and change the order that they're presented in. And I can also control how strong it is by adjusting its opacity, and I can control its blending mode. We'll talk about blending modes here in a minute. Now, for those of you guys who are Photoshop ninjas out there, a lot of what I'm going to show you here for the next couple of minutes is pretty common things for you, but not everybody has the background in Photoshop, so I'm going to cover a little bit of foundational material first. All right, we want to size this layer so that it fills the whole canvas. Easy way to do that is grab the Transform tool. It's the first tool in the toolbar, and then just click on the Fill button in the upper right-hand corner. And that'll automatically size it to fit my layer. There we go. Now, the trick to applying an image as a texture is to change the blending mode. And right here at the bottom of the layer stack is the blending mode pop-up. When you add a layer, it'll normally be set to normal, which think of it like opaque house paint. When you paint it over something, you can't see anything underneath it. By changing the blending mode, we can control how the upper layer blends with the layer below it, or all of the layers below it. There's quite a few different blending modes, and I'm not going to talk about all of them. I'm really going to talk about the ones that are the most useful in doing compositing work. And I'm going to kind of try to actually describe what they do for you so that you'll have a better understanding. Now, what most people end up doing is they just kind of surf through here, and if you move your mouse or your arrow key down this list, you can actually preview what those blending modes actually do, which is a really handy way to go through and see what they're going to do. But mathematically, let's just talk quickly about what they do. The first one, Darken, takes whatever the darker pixel is on the two layers. So in this case, the darker outer edge is darker on the upper layer than it is on the lower layer, so we see the pixel from that layer, where the center is actually lighter than the layer underneath, so we see the layer underneath. Multiply actually takes the two values and it adds them up, so they get, actually subtracts them, so they actually get even darker, so it kind of multiplies the two images together. So darken and multiply are going to make it darker. The opposing ones are lighten and screen. Lighten is kind of the opposite of darken. It's going to take whatever the lighter pixel is on the layer, and screen is going to put the two together so that it gets even lighter. The other two that are really useful for doing compositing are overlay and soft light. And these are the ones that are actually going to give you the most natural blending of those pixels together. So overlay is going to be the stronger version of the two, and then soft light is just a little bit softer version of that. For me, soft light is kind of the go-to blending mode the majority of the time. That's the one I'm going to use. Unless I'm putting a paper texture, really light texture over something, then I'll use multiply. But for this one, I'm either going to use overlay or soft light. Soft light tends to maintain the color a little bit more naturally, so we're going to use the soft light option. There we go. Let's turn the layer on and off so you can kind of see the before and the after. So there's without that overlay to give me a little bit of a vignette, and after. There we go. Now, if I don't like anything about that texture's position, I can move the layer around, and I can also use the masking brush to paint the texture off of my subject if I don't want it there. So I'm going to grab the masking brush here, and I'm just going to soften it on her. And we can use a mid opacity brush, about a 50% opacity, just enough to soften the appearance of the texture on her. I'm really just going to focus just on her face and neckline. There we go. Just so we keep her a little bit cleaner. Now the next step is we can continue to add new layers on top of it to add more texture and more grunge to create our own look. Let's go back to our extras. We'll go back to the textures. I'm just going to open up the Quick View browser. These are actually all of the categories of the textures that are in there. I'm just going to go over to the papers category, and we're going to add a paper texture overlay. You just scroll through till you find one you want. I really like this old antique postcard. I use it all the time. So we'll grab the postcard, and we're going to add that to the image. I was using my arrow keys to navigate through that quick view browser. You can use the arrow keys to zip through the quick view browser very quickly. If you hit the enter button, it'll descend into a folder. You can use the control left arrow or the command left arrow button to go back up a folder level, or if you are on an individual file and you hit return, it's going to open it, or if it's a preset, it's going to apply it. All right, there's our texture. I'm just going to use the transform tool again. We're going to rotate it so that it's the same orientation as our image, and then we'll hit the fill button to stretch it out to fill the canvas. I'm just going to make it a little bit bigger on the sides here. There we go. And then again, it's all about the blending mode to make that blend into my image. Now what I mentioned is I like to use multiply when I'm working with a paper. When you use multiply, it basically takes whatever the color and the texture of the paper is that you applied and applies it over the image. So whatever the white point of your paper texture is becomes the white point of the image that we're applying it to. There we go. So I like multiply. With that opacity slider, I can control how strong that look is. I'm only going to use it at about 70% here. And then maybe to finish this up, let's add kind of a photographic edge. I want to make it look like an old camera viewfinder, actually. So let's go back to our textures one more time. I'll go to the photographic category and grab this one called Brownie, which is actually looking through the viewfinder of an old antique camera. We'll add that as its own layer. We'll rotate it. We'll make it fit. And then we'll just change the blending mode again to multiply. So there we go. Now at any step in the process, because I've kept these on individual layers, I can go back and adjust these at any time. And when I save this as a layered Photoshop file, I can go back and change these. So let's say I show it to the client loves it, but they didn't really like having this border on it. Well, all I do is I open the file up and I just turn the border off. That's all I have to do. It's easy for me to give options and go back and adjust my work. Now, two more things I want to show you, which are handy tips when you're working with textures. I kind of showed you one already, and that's using the masking brush to remove textures from your image. I'm going to use that to just paint away some of these annoying dust bunnies that we inherited from this antique camera viewfinder here. There we go. And maybe we want to do the same thing with the postcard layer, the layer underneath. So I'm just going to go down a layer, and we want to remove some of that paper texture from her. Oh, but look, there's a problem. When I start to paint that away, because it has a color associated with it, I'm losing all that great color as well. So what I want to do is I want to show you how you can remove the texture without getting rid of the color. I'm just going to undo that. Let's go to Edit and Undo. And I'll show you how you can paint away the texture but maintain the color of the layer. So select the textured layer, and we're going to go to Perfect Effects. The trick is we want to just selectively blur part of that paper layer. Now the cool thing when you use the Perfect Photo Suite and you send a layer to one of the plugins like Perfect Effects or Perfect Black and White or even Perfect Portrait, you're only working on that layer, but yet you can see the entire layer stack and how everything works in it. So we see the entire image, we see the composite of what we've created, but if we look over here at the effect stack, all we see is actually just that paper layer that we're working on. All I want to do now is I just want to blur that paper layer only on her. So I'm just going to go over here to the Effect Options palette. I'm going to grab Blur. I'll use the Gaussian Blur option. You can use a pretty good radius like 20 or 30. I'm just going to turn this on or off, and let's zoom in a little bit so you can actually see what this has done. Second here. There we go. I'm going to turn that blur layer on and off so you can see. So there's with it off, and you can see all of the paper texture on our subject's face and on her shirt. And with it on, that blur, it smoothed out the texture but kept the color. Now, I really only want to do this on her. I want to keep the paper texture on the rest of the image. So here's the trick. We'll use the masking brush here inside of Perfect Effects now. We'll grab the brush. I'm going to hit the invert button. That is going to hide all of the blur. And now where I paint with the brush, it's going to bring back the blur. So now I can paint that blur in just where I want. It's not blurring my image. All it's doing is it's just softening the texture on the paper. And the great thing is you don't have to be super accurate about your painting with this either, because you can barely tell where the change occurs, and there's no color change and no tonal change. All right, there we go. Now we'll hit the apply button, and we'll send back our blurred results. So there we go. Let's go ahead. I'm just going to turn off everything except for our starting point so we can take a look. There's our original image right there. I did that by holding down the Alt key on a Windows keyboard or the Option key on a Mac and clicking on the layer that I'm interested in. In this case, I was only interested on the bottom layer, the layer that I started with. That turns off everything else and only shows me the layer that I want. And I can do the same thing again. I can Option click on the eyeball again, or Alt click on the eyeball again to turn all of the layers back on. All right. So there's how you can use the extras that come with the Perfect Photo Suite through Perfect Layers to create your own kind of vintage textured look by layering multiple layers together, controlling their blending mode and opacities. All right, Liz, any questions out there before we move to our next example?
Yeah, it looks like we've got a couple questions about when you go ahead and click save for this image, are all of those layers going to be saved with it, or is it going to be flattened automatically?
It depends on actually what file type you use to save it with. So I always like to save as a Photoshop file. And because I actually open this image from Lightroom, it's automatically going to save it as a PSD for me. That's actually controlled by my settings in the Perfect Photo Suite. And actually at the top, you'll notice right up here, it's already turned it to a PSD file. You can control the file formats that are saved when you come through Lightroom by going to your preferences in the suite and clicking on the Lightroom plugins tab right here. You can control the file type, the color space, the bit depth, and the resolution all right in here when you work through Lightroom. Now, if you're using the suite as a standalone, when you just go to save, you can just pick which file format you want, just like you would with any other application. And if you're working through Aperture, you can set the file type in your Aperture preferences. All right, any other questions?
No, let's keep on going.
Okay, I'm going to go ahead. I'm just going to save this image here, and it will save and close and return us back to Lightroom here. Come on. Actually, we'll just skip that. Let's go back to Lightroom. And the next thing that we want to talk about are building action sequences. So building an action composite where you take multiple images and you make it look like there was more motion in it than there was. I'm going to show you two different examples of this. The first one requires that you've got a camera on a tripod and that you've got a motor drive to do it. And most of you guys have probably seen this before, so I'm going to do it fairly quickly. I just want everybody to be able to see it who hasn't seen it before. What we have here is a motor drive sequence of 4 shots. These actually weren't even taken on a tripod. They were just close enough together that this will still work. What I want to do is I want to merge these together so we actually have the snowboarder in the shot 4 times. So I just select all 4 of those here in Lightroom, and then I'm just going to send it to the Perfect Photo Suite. When you select multiple images and you send it to the suite, it's going to automatically stack those together as new layers into one final Photoshop file. So you notice over here my layer stack, I've got 4 layers now, 1 layer for each of those images. All right, the next step is we just want to mask, using the masking brush, away each layer so that we see the snowboarder reproduced 4 times. So we'll grab the masking brush, and this is going to be a little counterintuitive, but trust me on this. What we want to do is we actually want to paint the snowboarder away in the top shot, in each shot. So let's go ahead. I'm just going to make sure my opacity is 100. My brush mode is set to paint out here. And hang on a second here. There we go. I'm just going to paint him away. There we go. So what I've done is I've painted him away. The reason I've done that is I can see where he is on this shot. And then what I really want to do is I want to paint away everything except for him. So the easy way to change that is just to hit the invert button on the masking brush tool options bar. And that'll invert the mask. So rather than painting him out, it's going to flip it around so that everything else is painted out except for him. So I hit the invert button and voila, now I see two copies of him. So what we've done is what we're actually seeing, so this makes sense to you, is we're seeing this bottom layer right here, or this second layer down right here, and we're seeing just a tiny bit of the layer above, just a part of the snowboarder. Now all we do is we just repeat that process as we go down through the next two layers. So I've selected the next layer, I use the masking brush, and then I'm just going to paint him out on this layer. You don't have to be super accurate on this because we're only viewing a small sliver of him in each layer. There we go. There's our next one. And we'll go down a layer and we'll do the same thing again. And invert. And voila, now we've actually created our snowboarder 4 times in the shot. With a little bit more care, I wouldn't have lost that little sliver on the top of the mountain here. I think I did that on the second layer. There we go, we can just clean that up. Just a little bit of careful brushing. Then we're going to use the crop tool to crop this down to be a more interesting composition. The crop tool is the second one down in my tool well. I think this will probably be a more interesting panorama shot. We don't need that tree on the right either, so let's get rid of that. Maybe move it up a little bit. And there we go. So we took those 4 images together, combined them to create an action composite. And then I can go through and create a merged composite layer at the top. This is a really handy tool as well. Go to the layer menu, pick new stamped layer, and this will create a new layer that merges all the layers below it together. And then I could use something like the retouch brush to kind of get rid of some of these goofballs. Oops. Some of these guys down here at the bottom that aren't interesting to me. And we'll use the clone staff option instead. Just select the source that we want to work from and then paste right over them. Select the source by holding on the Option key or the Alt key and paint right over. All right. Any questions on this one, Liz?
Let's see what we had. The first question is, how do you combine multiple images if you don't use Lightroom? If you're using the program as a standalone, how would you access those images you just loaded up?
That's a great question. There's a couple different ways to do it. An easy way is just select those images and then drag and drop them onto the Perfect Photo Suite icon is one way to do it. You can also, from the File menu, you can go to File and Open. And when you use the Open command, you can select multiple images at the same time. Or you can browse the folder that contains the images that you want to look at. So I could go over here to go File and Browse. And let's actually just go browse that folder so you can see how it works here. So now in my browser, there's my demo files, and I'll just go to Perfect Layers. And see right here, let me make this a little bit larger. There's those same images right there, including the Photoshop file that we've already created in the background. All I do is I just select the images that I want, the 4 images that we want to add, and I would just go to Open Selected from Browser, and it'll open those all as one merged file. All right. Any other questions?
The other question that we had was, why would you use New Stamped Layer versus just clicking on the Merge button?
That's a good question. So what the Merge button does is it merges whatever the selected layer or layers are together. The downside to doing that is once I merge those layers together, they're merged forever. So if I had made a mistake, if I got really critical, I mean, obviously I did my masking very quickly. If I zoomed in and was very critical, there's probably a few little flaws in my masks that I would want to clean up. If I had merged these all, basically flattened the image down to one layer, I wouldn't have the ability to go back. I'd have to do a bunch of manual retouching to fix those cases instead. Using the new stamped layer option gives me the benefits of both worlds. It gives me one layer with all the data on it, but I still have all the original layers under it that I can always go back to if I need to. All right, anything else?
That looks good for now. Let's go ahead and move on.
Okay, so in this this action sequence, we were lucky because we actually had multiple shots, but sometimes you want to create what looks like an action sequence when you only have one frame. So we're going to show you how to kind of create a stylized, simulated motion look here. Go back to Lightroom. I'm going to grab this jumping motorcycle shot. Let's send this to the suite. We're going to use some of those same techniques that we've used so far to do this. All right, here we go. I'm just going to use the Move tool. And the first thing I want to do is I want to just change my composition a little bit. I want to move the rider to more the upper left-hand corner. Actually, the first thing I want to do is I want to get rid of this little piece of dust that was on the camera sensor. So let's grab the retouch brush. I'm going to turn the clone stamp option off, and I'm just going to get rid of that little dust spot there. All right, now that that's out of the way, it keeps me from having to retouch it like 7 times. We're going to grab the Move tool, and we're just going to take this layer. I'm going to move it so that the rider is in a more interesting spot, kind of more this upper left-hand corner. The next step to create this look is I want to create many copies of this layer at different opacities, and I'm going to kind of trail them down towards the bottom right-hand corner. So it kind of looks like there's a motion ghost of the rider. So I'm going to hit the copy button. This will make a copy of that layer. I'm just going to set its opacity down. I'm going to go to about 50%. Here's a tip. You can automatically set the opacity of the layer just using the number keys on your keyboard. So if I want to set the opacity of this layer to 50%, I can just hit the 5 button on my keyboard and it'll automatically move it down to 50%. And I'm just going to drag that layer. You can see now we've created that ghost look. I'm just going to move it down and to the right a little bit. Cool. Now we're just going to repeat that, and with each layer copy we make, we're just going to make the opacity a little bit less and a little bit less. So let's hit the copy button again. That'll make a copy of that 50% layer. I'm just going to change it from 50% to 40% by hitting the 4 on my keyboard. I could always just go over to the slider and change it there too. There we go. Let's make another copy. And we're going to set this one to 30%, and we're going to drag it down. And we'll make a copy. And we're going to make this one 20%. Move it down. Let's make another copy. And let's do this one at 10%. And we'll move it down. And maybe one more. And let's do this one at 5%. And we'll move it down too. All right, so there we go. So we've made a series of copies at decreasing opacity, so it kind of has this kind of a motion-looking ghost behind it. Now there's 2 more steps to actually finish this. One is we have to fix this background. Right now we have a lot of transparency and a lot of layer edges that don't look very realistic, so we need to make sure we have a real-looking blue sky behind everything. And then 2, we have to make sure we have a full copy of our rider at the very top of it. So let's tackle both of those. The first thing is to extend the background so that we actually have that same blue behind everything. An easy way to do that is I'm just going to go down to my bottom, my original layer that I started with, down here, and I'm just going to make a copy of that layer. And I'm going to go to the very bottom layer. That's the original layer. We're going to use that transform tool, and I'm just going to stretch that layer way out. If you remember that original layer, the rider's kind of in the upper left-hand corner, and there's a lot of dead sky to the bottom right. So just using this transform tool, you can see how I can stretch this layer out in both directions. So I'm going to stretch it really far. Don't be afraid to stretch it really far. You see there's the rider, and I'm just going to move him over so that he's in an area where he's not going to affect the image. So there we go. We've managed to fix our sky problem. The last thing we need to do is we need to put our rider at the top. So to do that, we're going to grab the original image, and I'm just going to drag the layer order so that it's at the very top now. So we'll just drag it up to the top of our image. There he is. Now what we want to do is we need to hide everything except for the writer himself. We'll use the masking brush to do this. Oops, that's the retouch brush. We'll use the masking brush. I'm going to make sure I have the perfect brush option on. The perfect brush is going to allow us to paint, paint away the blue in the sky without sacrificing the writer. It's kind of a color-based self-masking brush. Super handy. All right, so I'm going to grab this guy. I'm going to set my feather down to a pretty small amount so I have a nice hard edge around the writer. And now all I do is I click in the sky. That's the color that I want to remove. And I'm just going to start to paint up here. Looks like we got a little bit of cleanup to do on the bottom layer that we didn't see until now. Don't worry about that. I'll show you how to fix that. Oops, I went a little too far in there. Sorry about that. So the perfect brush is constantly detecting the color under the center of the brush as you paint. And what I did is I brushed a little too cavalier and let my center of my brush touch the tire, so it picked up that black color and started to paint that away. There we go. All right, now the big ghost we see in the background is actually from our bottom layer. We just need to nudge that a little bit more to the right here. So I'm just going to stretch that layer out even larger and then push it further over here until the point where he's off screen. Almost there. There we go. All right, so there we were able to create a simulated motion composite by just adding up multiple copies of the same image and then just decreasing their opacity over time. All right, any questions so far?
Yeah, there was a question about how you would get some of the smaller areas in between the spokes of the wheel.
We could actually just continue to use the masking brush on that. So let's just go up here to our upper layer. We'll use the masking brush. We'll make sure that the perfect brush option is enabled. And I can just click in the center in the blue area of the wheel and paint around. Now, in this case, it doesn't really hurt the image because it's the same color of blue sky behind it. You can also use a new option in the perfect brush where you can hold the last color that was sampled, which can be useful too. So you can start to paint outside the wheel. So right now it's constantly sampling the blue color of the sky. But if I hold down the control key on a Windows computer or the command key on the Mac, it'll stop sampling. It allows me to paint in the inside of that wheel without losing any of the tire because it's only sampling the original blue color. Just like that. The other thing we can do is we can change our feather amount. The feather amount, when you're using the perfect brush option, controls how soft the edge of the transition is. So if you notice on the back of the blue tire, on the back of the tire, there's just a little bit of a blue line there. So if I bring that feather up a little bit and we paint over there, we'll be able to clean up that blue edge a little bit more. Just like that. All right. Any other questions?
We also had a question about whether you're using a Wacom tablet or whether you're using a mouse. And
I'm actually using a mouse.
What do you typically use when you're doing your editing?
You know, I do love Wacom. I try to use it whenever I can, but I tend to forget a lot of times because for me the tablet isn't efficient for doing the rest of my work. If I'm checking my email or writing a Word document or something like that, it's not a good pointing device for me in those cases. But if I know I'm going to sit down, I know I'm going to be using the suite, or I'm going to be using Photoshop for a period of time working on images, then I'll pull out my tablet, and I will use that because the pressure sensitivity that it gives you can be very handy. Plus, it's a very natural way to point. But today, just out of convenience, my mouse was sitting in front of me, so I was just using my mouse. You'll
You're not
notice
the
that.
only person who does that.
You'll notice up here in the tool options bar for the masking brush, there's some little W's, and those W's will turn on pressure sensitivity for that option if I'm using a Wacom tablet. So for example, if I was to click on this little W and use my Wacom tablet, the size of the brush is going to get bigger or smaller as I press down harder or softer. Let me actually grab my tablet here and I'll show you. Come here, brush. Helps to plug it in. There we go. All right, so now my tablet is alive. I'm going to make my brush just a little bit bigger. So the size pop-up controls the maximum size of the brush when you're using a tablet. Same thing with the opacity. It's the maximum opacity. And as you bring the mouse over the image, you're going to see the full size. But as soon as I start to paint, as soon as I touch my pen to the tablet, the brush is going to snap down to a small size. So you can see it's very small. I'm using very low pressure. My size is only about 50, and as I continue to press harder, that brush will grow with the pressure. And you look at the size slider, it continues to change and go up and down based on the pressure input, however hard or soft I press. You can do the same thing with the opacity as well. Let's actually just make this a little easier to see. I'm going to turn the mask view on here. Let's just go to a grayscale mask so you can see this. I'm going to kind of mess up the image here, so ignore the image up to this point. As we start to paint, you can see it's a very small brush, and as I press harder, it gets bigger and bigger and bigger, so you can really control the size. If I enable the opacity option as well, let's turn size off for a second. As I start to paint, it's going to paint with very low opacity, and as I press harder and harder, it's going to paint with more and more opacity, just like that. And if I was to toggle both of them on, it'll adjust both of those parameters at the same time. So I'll have a small, soft opacity brush, and as I press harder, I'll get a larger, harder opacity brush, just like that. All right. Hopefully that answered some questions on the use of Wacom tablets. Anything else?
Looks like we're good for now.
All right, cool. I'm going to move on to one more image, and we're going to actually use a little bit of Perfect Mask, and we're going to show you how you can combine multiple images together. Let me just close this image. We don't need it any longer. Let's go back to Lightroom and all right, so what we're going to do is we're going to show you how to recreate this image. This is actually a completely fake image. This is composed of 3 different shots. This is actually what happens when you have a certain image that you need, but you don't have A, the location, or B, the right weather to accomplish what you need. So what we actually did, I'm going to turn off these upper layers so you can actually see what we started with. What we really started with on this image was this shot in the studio of our model, just on a plain white background. We knew kind of what we were going for. We wanted to have this late afternoon at the beach, cozy Oregon coast kind of a feel. But we didn't want to have to drive the 2 hours to the coast, plus you have no idea what the weather's going to be over there. And I think we shot this in the middle of the winter time. So what we did is we just brought our model in the studio. We thought about where we were going to put the sun in our shot, our sun being metaphorical because the sun wasn't even really there. But we just used a fairly hard light source, high and to the right, to light our subject. And then what we need to do is we need to find a background to go behind her. So I'm going to turn this off. So we found this stock kind of sunset image. You can use any image back there that would make sense as long as the lighting conditions and the lighting angle and the time of day kind of match. And then we needed something in the foreground. We wanted to make it look like she was standing on this hill. So we had some grass from another stock image. The grass actually wasn't was from a vertical shot. We needed a longer piece of it, so all we did is we just mirrored the grass around. So if you notice, there's kind of a, it looks the same on both sides. That was just because we mirrored it to stretch it out. If we'd stretched it, made it bigger, then the grass would be out of scale. The grass would look too big. It looked like, you know, giant tree grass instead of real grass. Now, if we had more time, we would have found a different stock image where we had longer grass that was more realistic. But again, you're dealing with creating an image from what you've got at hand because of the limitations of time and nature. So what we're going to need to do is we need to mask our subject off this background, and we also need to mask the blue sky off this grass to create the composite image. And we're going to do both of those inside of Perfect Mask, and we're going to do it using two different sets of tools. There's several different tool sets in Perfect Mask depending on the type of image and the challenge that we're working on. So we're going to start on our first one right here, our subject on the studio background. I make sure that's my selected layer, and I'm just going to click on the mask button up here in the upper left-hand corner. Mask will load up, and I noticed in the beginning there were a couple questions from folks that wanted to have some of the tools explained, and we'll kind of do that now, although I see we're a little short on time, so I'm going to talk quickly. The first set of tools, and the set that we're going to use for this image, is the Keep, Drop, and Refine brush. It's the first three tools in Perfect Mask's arsenal. And it's the newest set of tools, and the way it works is by segmenting the image, and then you define segments that you don't want, and then from that it looks at where the edges of the segments are and can kind of intelligently figure out where the edges are at. So to understand that, we put in what we call segment view, and if we come down here to the bottom in the little pop-up for the overlay, we can select the segments. And I'm just going to zoom in a little bit here so we can see what this looks like. This is the segmented version of the image. You can see how the background has coalesced kind of into one solid color. Actually, two segments. There's a segment on the front and a segment on the back. So that means if I use the drop brush and I tell it, I'm not interested in anything inside of this segment, it's going to automatically remove that entire segment for us. So it's a very quick way to remove big chunks of the image with that segmentation. Now, up here in the top is a slider called segment, and this controls the segment size. And one of the first things I'll do is when I'm going to mask an image is I'll open it up. It'll take Perfect Mask a second or two to segment the image. I'll go to this segment view, and I'll look at what the segmentation map looks like. What I'm looking for is one where the big areas that I want to get rid of have kind of coalesced together like this, like it's done. If we take this segment size, and I'm going to bring it way down to something small, like maybe 1, it'll take a second, and it'll resegment the image. You'll notice that there's now more segments, and I've got some junky segments in these solid color areas. So this is useful if I have a subject and a background that are really close together in color, but it's going to take me longer to mask because I'm going to have to define more areas to get rid of. If I bring this segment size up really high to like 24, you notice how it actually starts to eat up my subject. So the background color is now close enough to the subject color, and I've started to lose information here. So that wouldn't be a good setting for this image either. So through trial and error, we found that for most images, a segment size of 8, which is the default, we usually do a pretty good job. But you can tune it at any time using that segment slider, but be sure you go into segment view so you can actually see what it looks like. All right. The next ones are refine and tolerance. Tolerance is a relationship of this auto expand button right here. When auto expand is turned on, anything that is close to an area that I paint, so for example, if I was to make a brushstroke over here, if there was another segment touching this segment that was within 10 color values, it would get removed as well. So it's kind of, it continues to help the auto expansion. And then refine we'll talk about here in just a moment. I'm going to go ahead and turn off segment view. Let's go to our regular all layers view. And with this drop brush, I'm just going to make one brush stroke right over here. There we go. So you can see how that's automatically removed that whole right-hand side of the image. What the refine slider does is it controls how thick of an edge it looks at when it does the removal. So right now at 24, it's going to paint a pretty thick edge of the refine brush. If we go ahead and we undo that and we set this refine down to something smaller, let's say 4, and I make that same kind of a brush stroke, you'll see how I get a very different result. I actually get a harder, cleaner edge result. I actually tend to like a fairly small amount of refinement, and then I'll use the refine brush, that's the third tool down, to paint the areas that I think need more refinement, things like hair. So I'm going to use that small refined amount, and I'm just going to continue to paint away segments that I don't want. So I'll just make another stroke up here through the top. I don't want any of that. There we go. So now we've removed probably 80% of the offending background. All I have left is a little bit in her hair. And to remove that, we'll use the refine brush. The refine brush will look at the neighboring segments and automatically clean these up for us. So now I just run the refine brush over the edge of the hair, and it will now clean up and make that hair softer and more natural. And if I turn the use color decontamination option on and do this, it'll do an even better job because it will remove any of the sky color from the edge of the hair. So we'll just run that refine tool along here a couple times till we clean that up and it looks nice. There we go. The last thing I want to do is I'm going to use the chisel tool right along the back side of her dress just because it's picked up a little bit of a highlight that we don't want. The chisel tool will shave off just a pixel or two along that edge. So we'll just run that chisel right along there just to remove that little highlight we don't like. Perfect. So now we've done a good job of masking our subject out. We'll just apply that now. And there we go, back into our image. The next step is the grass. We need to take the grass layer and we need to paint away the blue. We'll do the same thing in Perfect Mask. Or actually, we'll use Perfect Mask. We're going to use a very different set of tools for doing it, though. So inside of Perfect Mask, rather than using the top tools, the drop and refine tools, those are good when you have an image with a fairly solid edge or things like hair, but something like tree branches or this grass or lace or tulle in a wedding dress, they're very large, indistinct areas with no real borders to work with. In this case, you'll notice there's a big area from the top edges of these blades of grass. The blue, the background, extends all the way down in here, like a third of the height of the grass. So it would be very hard for this tool to do a good job on the grass. So instead, we're going to use an older, more global tool. We're going to use the Keep and Drop eyedropper tools and the Magic Brush. And if you're a longtime user of Perfect Mask, these are the tools you're probably the most familiar with. What you'll do is you'll use the Keep and Drop eyedroppers to sample the colors you want to keep and the colors you want to get rid of. So using the drop eyedropper, I just clicked in the sky and I selected blues out of the sky that I don't want. And you see those right over here in my drop color palette. I sampled from light to dark all the blues I want to get rid of. Then I did the same thing with my keep dropper, and it actually has automatically stored these images from the last time that I did this. It remembers the colors on a per image basis for you automatically. I'm going to use the keep dropper, and I went through and I clicked on colors in the grass. So I made sure I had the yellows and the browns and the greens of the grass, and that makes up my keep colors. Then I use the Magic Brush. The Magic Brush works by comparing those colors. It's going to paint away all the blues, and it's going to keep all of the yellows and browns and greens for me. So now I can just paint right through here, and it will automatically paint those blues away. Now, a good tip when you use the Magic Brush is on an image like this, I could just double click on the Magic Brush icon and it'll paint the whole image for me. I'm just going to double click and it will paint away that whole blue sky for me in a single step. Wonk. There we go. Just like that. All right. Let's apply. We'll send that back. And there's our finished composite. Now, if we don't like this sky, we think that this sky is maybe a little too late in the day, we've actually got pretty midday or early afternoon looking grass in a sky that probably is a little too late in the day, it's easy to swap it out for another one. I'm just going to go down to that point of my layer stack. I'll go to my extras, and the suite comes with tons of replacement skies that you can use as well. Plus, if you have one of your own, you could use that. We'll go to the backgrounds category. We'll bring up the quick view browser, and let's go to our skies category. And I'll just look through and find a sky that I think will look better. Let's see. Actually, this one right here will probably do a decent job. We'll grab that one. We'll add that. It pops into place. We'll use the transform tool to move it and put it in position. Looks like the light's coming from the left in this case, so I'm just going to flip it left to right so it's brighter over here, darker over there, and voila. There we go. Our finished composite. All right, Liz, any questions?
Yeah, it looks like there was a question about the refine brush. So when you use it, does it remember the colors that you're painting over, or do you have to maintain the center of the brush over something? I think there was a little bit of confusion about how maybe it works.
The refine brush is easy. You don't have to remember anything or teach it anything. All you do is you just paint over the stuff where the edge is indeterminate. So if you have something with a really hard edge, like along her sweater, you notice I didn't really brush the refine brush along there because it did a pretty good job of it automatically. But in the hair, it's a less defined area, so we had background color kind of sneaking in there. All you do is you just paint right over that, and the brush figures it out automatically. It looks at the segments that were left, the segments that we told it to keep, and basically everything is a keep until you tell it you don't want it, and then the segments that we told it to drop. So it looked at the white colors that we told it to drop, and it looked at the segments that we said to keep, which were the flesh colors and the hair colors and the sweater colors, and it just automatically figured out what to do, whether it was something you wanted to get rid of or not get rid of. So you don't have to be careful about where you brush it or assigning any colors to it. It's all done automatically. That's the great thing about it.
So is that the same for the magic brush tool, and how does that differ, or how is that the same?
Magic brush is different, definitely. It is much more critical in the colors that you select. You actually have to select them. It's not an automatic process. With that, you actually have to select the keep and drop colors using those dropper tools. So let's just grab another image here real fast, and we'll kind of go over that again.
And really quickly, while Dan is pulling up some other images, we've got a lot of questions about whether you guys are going to be able to see this webinar again. So we'll be rendering this webinar and putting it up on our YouTube page in the next couple of days. It's youtube.com/onOneSoftwareU. So youtube.com/onOneSoftwareU. And you guys will be able to watch this again and review maybe a couple of things that you guys might have missed. So hopefully, to answer all of those questions that I see popping up in that questions panel, you will have access to rewatching this again.
So let's see. So with the first three tools, the keep and the drop and the refine, those are the kind of the newer set. When you open the image, everything is automatically assigned to the keep group. So the top brush, the keep brush, you don't have to use. The only time you'd use that is if you accidentally made a mistake. If I was to paint over something with a drop brush that I actually wanted to keep. Let me show you. So let's say I take the drop brush here, and before we do anything, let's always look at our segments, see what it looks like. Yep, the default settings did a pretty good job there for me. And by a pretty good job, I mean that it's grouped the sky all into one nice segment, and it's not leaking into anything that I want. It's not taking up any of the screen or any of the trees. So if I was just to make one stroke through the sky, it automatically blasts out the sky. Now, if I made a mistake and I accidentally touched the screen with it, and the screen gets painted out, oh, I didn't want to do that. Well, I could undo, just use the undo command, or I could use the keep brush, and I could just paint that screen back in. Either way works. It just defines it as to whether those segments are ones you want to keep or ones you want to get rid of. The refine tool is the one where it goes along the boundaries of those segments and cleans them up. So if we were to look at the segments again here, and we look, there's this big dark blue segment that makes up the sky, and by the time it gets down here into the trees are made up of lots of these little lighter blue and brown segments. What the refine brush will do is, as I paint along the tree, it's going to take any dark blue color and get rid of it, and it's going to take any color in these darker browns and keep them. And it does that just by comparing the colors of the adjacent segments. So now with that refine brush, if I was just to paint through here, it will paint away the sky through it just like that. So that's the way the newer, more modern tools work, the first three. And they work great in most cases, but there are cases where they're not going to do a good job, and that's when the colors are really, really close to each other. The magic brush will do a better job, or if I have something that has a very, very thick, indeterminate area, like tree branches are a great example. Let's see, I think I might have some trees in here somewhere. I don't have any tree branches anymore, but like the grass would be a good example. Let's just take a look at that image again. So if we were to work on the grass, if we tried to do this with the drop brush, and I try to paint through the sky, it'll get rid of the sky, but because the blue is so small and creeps its way so far down into the grass, it doesn't do a very good job at the edge. And even if I use the refine brush over these areas, it's still going to have a hard time because there's going to be so much blue in the keep segments. So even if I was to brush through here like this, I'm still probably not going to get a satisfactory result out of it. I'll probably get a bunch of little blue dots. Plus it'll take a long time because it's a lot more math to do. There we go. So see, we got a bunch of blue noisy stuff left over that we don't want. So a better approach on this, let me just undo a couple steps here, is to use those keep and drop tools. Those will do a better job in these thick, indeterminate areas like tree branches or a wedding veil. It'll definitely do a better job on wedding veil. Smoke, it'll do a better job on smoke. Glass, things like that. It'll do a better job. It takes a bit more work because you have to assign those keep and drop colors in order for it to work, though. All right. Hopefully that answered the question. Anything else out there, Liz?
Yeah, there were a couple questions about some of the extras inside the suite. What resolution are they, and do they need to be the same resolution as your original image for it to look good?
They are, I'm not actually positive what size they are these days. Let's go take a look. I want to say they're probably in the 3,000 to 4,000 pixels on the long dimension size. So they're not huge, but if you're applying something as a texture or you're applying something as a sky, it's not really going to have a big effect. If I'm using one of the backgrounds and I want to place it on an image that's much larger than the original image, then we're going to have to interpolate it up. We're going to have to add pixels to do that. And we'll do that resizing. The image won't look pixelated, but it might look soft instead. So let's go in here and look at some of the skies, and let's just see what kind of size they are. Down here in the bottom, it'll tell me what size. Oh, just tells me the size on disk. Let's open one of these up and actually see how big it is. Go to the info pane, and it tells us it's about 4,500 pixels by 3,000 pixels. So pretty good size. Don't worry about the resolution, the number of pixels per inch. That'll get scaled automatically based on the document that you're going to. So if your document is a higher resolution or a lower resolution, the image will automatically get scaled to that resolution. So think of that just as a measure of density, not actually a measure of real information.